Are you ready for a story about love affairs, kidnappings, murder, and endangered sea turtle habitats?
If so, then it's time to go back to that tropical island we bought off the coast of Nicaragua.
So we're doing a full recap of The Price of Paradise on this episode of So Much Crime.
So little time.
Just a reminder to subscribe to our Patreon, patreon.com/so much crime, so little time.
Also, please remember to rate us if you haven't yet on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen, and also to tell your friends about us. Spread the love about So Much Crime, So Little Time. Thank you.
Now, here's the show. Sit back and enjoy.
Welcome to So Much Crime, So Little Time. I'm Jeff.
And I'm Dee. Before we start, warning, there will be spoilers in this episode. We're talking about all of the podcast, The Price of Paradise.
If you haven't listened yet, check out our preview episode on the show. It's the one before this one in your feed. You'll also find a link for The Price of Paradise in our show notes.
As a reminder, The Price of Paradise came out in April and May of 2024.
There are 7 total episodes, plus there's one bonus episode, and the host is Alice Levine.
In our preview episode, we introduced the story and how Jayne and her husband Phil decided to sell up their house in England, rainy England, to buy an island. Where, Jeff?
Off the coast of Nicaragua.
Which is how apparently some English people pronounce it. And once they get there, this is their idea of paradise. By the way, they can't swim. They realize that the island was never really up for sale. And they get into a lot of hot water with some locals who don't want them there.
That's pretty much it. That's the first episode. All right, Dee, let's discuss Price of Paradise.
Okay. Jeff. I had thoughts on...
I'm sure you do.
Yeah. Before we jump into our thoughts, let's do really quick snapshot, not episode by episode because I hate that, but like snapshot what happens. Episode 2, Jayne gets annoyed at, is it Teodoro? Is that how?
Teodoro. Yeah.
Teodoro, and fires him because she was hooking up with him and then he didn't want her anymore because he was hooking up with the chef. They get kidnapped. Phil ends up having really bad burns. And ends up in hospital. Allegedly, Teodoro is one of the kidnappers who came back for the family having been fired. Phil never really recovers and ends up passing away. Then it turns out Phil was not the kid's father, but a Phil who changed his last name so that himself and Jayne could get the kids out of the country. That was a turn that I wasn't expecting. Their real father then turns up with a Daily Mail crew, so not with Channel 4. He turns up for less than a day just to make a scene and get some photos.
Yeah, the real Phil Gaskin makes an appearance.
Yeah, thoughts. Meanwhile, we're introduced to Maria.
Yes, Maria Acosta, human rights lawyer.
So she's fighting against the people who are selling the island to foreigners because the island is sacred, for the turtles and for the locals, for the fishermen. There's like spring, one of the only natural springs there.
Yeah, it's a source of fresh water for fishermen.
Her husband is brutally murdered. At first, she says it has to be, what's your man's name?
Oh, Sakov, Peter Sakov.
Sakov, the guy who had the islands for sale. But then people turn on Maria and claim maybe she got her husband killed. Eventually, she has to flee the town that she's living in, as she's threatened so many times. And it appears that allegedly that many members of the police and the judicial system are actively against her, even though the evidence clearly points to the gringo, which is your man, what's his name again?
Peter Sakov.
Jayne ends up back in the UK, but then goes back and buys a different island, pours loads of money into it, ends up, and a hurricane took it out. Most of her work, is pulled down in the hurricane, so she called it quits and goes back to England. What have I left out?
I mean, those are kind of the high points or low points, or those are the points, I guess. Yeah. Where do we want to begin discussing this? There's so much to discuss over like these, 6 plus the bonus episodes that we listen to.
I don't know. Okay. So in the preview, I had some beef with the structure of how things are being told, where you had this kind of sarky type of narration running in parallel to pieces of we never mentioned, of course, anyone has listened to the preview episode, the film crew are there for a lot of this, but they're also not there for every part. So some parts, some of the conversations are recreated as to how they apparently went down. I didn't love this whole narration. I felt very much like it was like an audiobook. And for me, obviously it continued. I'm sure for some people it works. That's what they're into. I just thought the story was shocking enough without it requiring this scripted rom-com TV drama style narration going through it.
I have a different take on that.
Ooh.
I think I also didn't
Fight.
Well, I don't. This is more of like a take what you said and take it in a different angle. I initially liked Alice Levine's kind of snarky tone when she was talking about the Gaskins, but when we get into the Maria Acosta story, that just seemed tonally off to me. Like the Maria story seemed so much more tragic and so much more serious, and it didn't seem to really deserve that sort of flippant tone. And going back and forth between those two stories, I had issues with. I guess, like, to step back from that even and think about the podcast as a whole, I don't know. I feel like these were two different stories. Yes, they're about the same island, and it's about people sort of at odds with each other, right? Jayne wants to live on this island that she thinks she has a right to because she paid a bunch of money for it. Maria is sort of the representative of the people of Nicaragua who don't think they can just, this island can be sold. But the stories that we hear are so tonally different.
Yeah.
It to me, like, and when you have a narration that is so strongly picks a tone that is very distinct, right? Like if the narration was a little bit more neutral, it might have worked a little better. But we're going back and forth from like making fun of the life choices of the Gaskin family to hearing about Maria Acosta's husband being killed and her being isolated from her friends and, you know, not having any kind of source of justice or relief. That's so different from this family from England that just decides they want to go live on the beach.
I know, but I suppose I don't think this is ever alluded to, but maybe their focus was these are two women who are connected through the story and who are both basically run out of the area because of how other people.
Story. That's not the way the story was presented, though.
I agree. Okay. I'm just throwing it out there to be devil's advocate. Maybe that's what they're going with.
I think that story is there. One of the things I want to ask you about this is, like, who's the villain of this story?
The men in the judicial system who are being paid off.
Like, there's a lot of bad men in this story.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is
who's
money
the hero of the story? Is Maria the protagonist of this story?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think she is. She's the most, like, noble, virtuous. She's also the person who participated in the podcast, so we hear a lot from her.
Okay, so this is another thing that pisses me off. They only said at the very end that we weren't going to hear anything. We were not hearing anything from Jayne's point of view. And I know throughout we were getting snippets of her in the recording, but I felt at some point she was going to come in. I felt at some point we were going to hear from her. It was only at the very end they're like, we contacted her and she didn't want to have anything to do with it. I think they should have mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, because I think that's problematic.
I think that's problematic, especially when you're going in with this sarky reading of things. Like one of the podcasts you compared this to in the preview was, I was going to say
Filthy
the Hamster
Rituals.
Justice.
Yeah, no, Filthy Rituals.
Filthy Rituals. So in that case, the hosts of Filthy Ritual had this kind of the similar snarky commentary as Alice Levine seems to have, but they also interacted with Keith. He was present. He was part of it. In parts, it sounded like he may have been asked, you know, how were you able to be conned, like how, basically it's pretty silly. Like, how did you manage it, kind of thing. So he is speaking to that. So, but here I feel like there's this judgmental tone about something someone did in 2001. And Jayne Gaskin herself mentions so often how the media at the time were so rude, and so they put her down and blah, blah. Like, I'm not saying her choices were right, but what I'm saying is, if you're going to have that sarky narration, at least have her, like, give her a chance to respond. And I don't think that worked for me.
I don't think that worked for me either. I think it was, I don't know how sympathetic of a character she is, but I feel like the narration felt so biased against her from the start, right? Like, it was making fun of this family from the start.
But from so many different ways, not just her decisions, but like her going around topless, and she likes having like wild red hair, and I don't know, there was all these comments about her as a person that were nothing really to do with her decision to move there.
No, I mean, it everything from, honestly, it was the clothes she was wearing when we first met her in England, to the way her relationship with Teodoro is dropped. It's presented this, like, I mean, I guess it is scandalous, but it's she's made to look bad, whereas this guy, not a good guy, right? Of the bad guys in this, he's near the top of the list, right? So yeah, there's a different version of this telling of this story, that whether it involves her and she gets to kind of tell her side and how she feels 20 something years later, or is maybe a little bit more balanced or sympathetic to like what she might have been thinking, what she might have been going through, because we get that from Maria.
Yeah.
Right? We hear her perspective. We hear how difficult this was for her, and how, like, over time how it changed. We don't get that from Jayne. We don't hear from Phil because he's dead, and we don't hear from the kids. And they mentioned this in the bonus episode, that they, even though the kids are now adults, they intentionally did not contact them.
Well, they'd never given their okay
consent
for this, and the consent for this in the first place. So yeah, they didn't think it was right, which I thought was great. I do have to say, episode 8 was my favorite episode.
Is the bonus episode? Why was that your favorite?
I don't know. Maybe it was the format was my favorite. Alice Levine liked her so much more there when she was just having an opportunity to chat. So she was chatting to James and Billy. So Billy was the researcher who was on the island for a good bit of time with the Gaskins, and James was the host. And that style for me is so much more appealing.
Wait, I'm sorry, Dee. Are you saying that you prefer a podcast that's talking about a podcast?
I prefer the chats.
Huh. If only someone made that as their whole, like, thing.
I know. Feels like there's a real niche in the market there, Jeff.
Please tell your friends.
But I do. I don't know. It was such a wild story. So intriguing. Completely binge worthy. And I won't take that away from it. It's not that I didn't want to. Like, there's podcasts we've listened to before for this that I would say, I would have stopped after episode 2 had we not been recording. I probably would have kept listening to this because it was so wild.
It was wild. It was definitely engaging. It did a lot of that teasing thing, that, the cliffhangers, or like the cliffhangers at the start, the cliffhangers at the end, like things that kind of keep you going. Like, structurally, though, I mean, we've talked about this before. 7 episodes, they're all about 30 minutes long. It's hard to argue with that format, right? Like, it just moves so quickly that it's a low time investment, and there is a lot of plot, right? Like, we're covering a lot of ground, a lot of years, a lot of events, a lot of crazy events.
Oh, well, and in a way that kind of annoyed me. I felt like just the way they dropped a few things in, you alluded to it with the story of Jayne and Teodoro. If you didn't listen to that properly, you would have had to go back and like re-listen, which I did twice, because I was like,
I did too. Yeah.
Did I miss that? Did I mishear that?
Can I also say, what's the story of the cook? Because when they arrive on the island, this is an island that doesn't even have plumbing or electricity. And so I'm real curious. They mention, and I think it's in the first episode, about the reality TV show crew and how, okay, so there's one little like shack on the island, and then the TV crew basically is in tents,
like,
right?
With a hole in the ground for a toilet.
Yes. but over time they're building infrastructure and they add people. And I'm just curious, like the logistics of this with the TV crew running around, with the 3 kids running around, like it just seems like it's such a bizarre thing, right? Like this turns out not like Castaway, where it's just Tom Hanks by himself on an island.
Were you sad about that? I know you were looking forward to that type of
I said it before, I'll say it again. It's a great movie. But
so they say.
But I want to ask something. There's a couple of very specific things that stuck out to me that we haven't covered yet. And I had a question for you. In episode 4, Phil and Jayne, so this is after the kidnapping, right? They're back on the island. Phil is recovering from burning his arm and he's not doing well. He's having trouble breathing from the smoke inhalation. He has asthma. Jayne wants to stay. Phil wants to go. And the way it's described, Phil basically goes to the kids and is like, hey, let's do some polling. Who wants, ice cream and civilization? Or who wants sand fleas and mosquitoes? My question for you is, what do you think about couples using their children to resolve their disputes?
I don't think that's what he was doing.
That's what it felt like to me.
It felt to me like he was trying to convince her that the only reason they were there was for her, and it wasn't just her in the mix.
It seemed like he was unable to convince her to change her mind, and so he was basically trying to outnumber her by getting everyone else on his side.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like if he's doing that day to day, it's kind of undermining her. But given the scenario, like if my husband did that to me constantly as we're picking dinners or picking whatever, I might be a bit not too happy about it. Like we're in this, we're chatting about it, we're making decisions. But if I made them move to a desert island where there is no plumbing, they've no friends, he's had such a bad injury, he's asthma, he's struggling and should really be closer to a hospital. But I'm like, but I want to live here. I think I wouldn't feel bad if my husband was like, kids, do you hate it here?
I mean, he does eventually go and he does eventually die not that long after. So maybe he knew that he wasn't doing well. All right, Dee, in the end, do you think this one was worth your time?
I was surprised at the end of the podcast when they announced all of the awards that it has won. Because we've listened to many podcasts, which are really good, and many which we thought were fine. And this was an amazing story. The format was just not for me. But if it's winning all these awards, it's obviously for some people, just not for me. So it's a no from me. But I'm glad I know of the story. It's wild.
Yeah, I guess I agree with that. I definitely don't think it deserves... I don't think it's an award-winning podcast. I don't think the quality of the storytelling is there. I also, honestly, something we didn't talk about was I found that a little bit confusing at times just to follow the thread of the story.
Is that because of the 2 parallel stories going?
Yeah, I think so. I think like this isn't a podcast I think lends itself well to distracted listening. It's too fast. It's too so dense with characters.
Like you blink and you miss an affair.
And there's 2 Peters, 2 Phils, a Steve.
The dad thing was mad, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Because he was like, I didn't even know they were here. I'm like, where did you think they were?
I did also appreciate, you mentioned the bonus episode being your favorite. I did like the bonus episode. I particularly liked when they bring up, I think it's at the very end of the bonus episode, Alice's pronunciation of Nicaragua.
Yeah.
And she kind of calls out how no one on the production team mentioned that, hey, you're pronouncing that oddly. But maybe that's a British regional thing. I don't know where that comes from. Well,
it's one of those words right now that I don't know if I can pronounce it because I've heard it so many times, but I know what I've heard the majority of the times has not been accurate because as well you keep mispronouncing it as a joke because she mispronounced it. So now I'm just like, I can't. Give me a month and then ask me.
Okay. You don't want to try it right now?
No.
Nicaragua.
Like agua. It won't be one I'll forget, I'll tell you that much. Also, who do we want to hang out with?
Who do I want to hang out with? I guess
Maria?
Maria? Maria just seems solid all around, right? Like, she's a human rights, or was she a human rights lawyer?
Environmental rights.
Yeah, she's a lawyer who does good work.
She's a good lawyer.
She's a good lawyer. And
It's so patronizing. Who's a good lawyer?
Is there anyone else you'd want to hang out with from this story?
I would really, and I totally appreciated what they said in the bonus episode that they didn't contact the kids. I would really love to speak to one of the children when they are, and they are now,
yeah,
you know, in their 30s or 40s, or maybe when they have their own family, if any of them have their own family. I'd love to speak to them and just see it from their point of view.
Yeah, what a bizarre experience to go through as a kid. And I mean, the island alone, let alone the kidnapping and all of the extra stuff, just up and leaving England to go live on this island like this is so unusual.
Completely, yeah.
And then all this other stuff happened. Before we go, just a reminder to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/so-much-crime, so little time. We've been putting a bunch of good bonus content on there. We also will sometimes throw early access to content there. And you support us in making the show, so we appreciate it.
Thank you. What are we doing next time?
All right, Dee. What's a part of the world we haven't been to yet?
You're going to have to narrow it down.
Okay. What's a continent we haven't covered yet?
Asia?
Pongsu took place partially in North Korea.
We've been to Europe. We've been to Australia.
Yes.
We've been to
North and South America.
Yeah.
Do you remember your continents?
I don't like that you're putting me on the spot with this.
Oh, I didn't mean to turn this into a geography quiz. That leaves Africa and Antarctica.
Oh, presumably we're going to Africa.
Well, surprise for you, we're going to Antarctica.
Stop it.
Yeah. In 2000, there was a mysterious death of a scientist at the South Pole. Do you know much about the laws of Antarctica?
No.
I don't either. We're going to find out. Turns out it's a mystery that maybe was never solved. It's called The Secret History of Antarctica: Death on the Ice.
Is that a really cold case?
Oh, wow. Yes, the coldest of cases.
That's next time on So Much Crime.
So Little Time. So Much Crime, So Little Time is a production of Mind Glove Media. The executive producer is Paxton Caloriso. Our associate producer is Blythe Ty. Our theme music was composed by Vyacheslav Starostin. If you haven't done it yet, please subscribe to this show on your podcast app. And don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and a review. Even better, tell your friends. To join the discussion, look for us on social media. Check out the show notes for all the links. Thanks for listening.